Oh. So last week we got a chance to introduce ourselves, and we also got a chance to had a review of the history and current status of MSRs around the world. We did some taxonomy of MSRs, and we compared some of the designs like MSRE, like SOCON 500, and also the Chinese molten salt test reactor, which all looks very similar. And then also we get a chance to review the development sign up on the test reactor and the regulatory frameworks in both China and Canada. So that's I believe we had a good review of the background information. I also received a lot of excellent questions. Unfortunately, we didn't have a lot of time to answer all the questions, but hopefully we'll be able to answer your questions in this week's workshop and the workshop in the following weeks. So the second week, today we're going to introduce the SOCON 500, which is a scaled up molten salt reactor. We're going to also review the general safety features of the SOCON 500. And in the following weeks, as you can see on the screen, we're going to introduce neutronics, some hydraulics next week, and then followed by operation and balance of plant, and then off gas, instrument control, radiation protection. And finally, in the sixth week, we're going to introduce the safety assessment. Hopefully, this series of workshop will give you a general idea of what SOCON is up to and what are the safety features and what are the things you want to pay attention to. So today I'm going to do this workshop by myself, but next week when we get into the neutronics, I'm going to introduce you my colleague Manu, who's currently living in Milano, Italy, and so he's going to talk about more about neutronics in the core. So let's start today's workshop. So today we're going to give you a general introduction of SOCON 500 power plant and highlight the safety features that comes with the SOCON 500. So we're going to talk about the power plant first, and then we're going to just briefly introduce the safety philosophy of the SOCON design. Then we're going to review the safety features of Molten Sword in general, and then I'm going to highlight what safety features the SOCON 500 will have. Of course, those safety features were enabled by the general safety features of Molten Sword. So the last part, we will examine the SOCON power plant and to find out what are the safety features and how do they compare to LWRs. Okay, so let's start with the general introduction, and this is a artistic impression of the SOCON of two SOCON 500. As you can see on the screen, we have two power plant, each have 500 megawatt electric power, and then you can see there's a ship in the middle, which we call can ship, and that basically ship the fuel and ship the reactor core to the power plant. What can you see on the screen is on the right, there's a vault that is open. Let me just get my pointer. Just give me a second. Okay, so Bob, can you see my pointer on the screen?
I can see.
Okay.
I can see.
Okay, excellent. So as you can see, there's an open on the vault. So that's where the reactor core is, and the Korean just moved the core out of the power plant and trying to load it into the can ship. So that's how we going to change the core. And in the week 4, we're gonna examine this in detail on how we can handle this. But in general, you can see the 2 power plants are side by side. But in our first one, the first demonstration reactor, we're only going to have a 500 megawatt power plant. So let's go to the details here. Now here is the SOCON 500 overview, and this is one of the power plant you saw on the previous slide, and we're looking from the top. On the right side, this is a general what we call fission island, separated from here to the right, and this is the equivalent to the reactor building of the conventional power plant. And to the left, it's a balance of a plant, or we call BOP. And let me just introduce it from the right side. The first set of cells are the used fuel vault, which I will go into the detail in the next few slides. And here are the decay heat cooling ponds. And then moving to the left, we see what we call can silo halls. So you can see there's 4 cans in each of the cans silo halls. Now, remember the SOCON 500 is a modular design. So it has multiple reactor cores. And right now we're seeing 4 because at each time, there's only 2 cores are in power operation, and the other 2 cores are in cool down states. So again, we're gonna examine this carefully in week 4. But here you have a general idea that how these cores are arranged in the power plant. And from the top, you could see this is the primary loop pump, and this one is the secondary loop pump. And here we have a opener, which we call the transfer cask valve. So this valve is used to host the transfer cask, which hold the fresh fuel that we can load to the power plant. So after the can silo, we have this secondary heat exchanger cell, and you can see the secondary heat exchanger right here. So you can see there's only 2 secondary heat exchanger compared to 4 cans, because as I mentioned, there's only 2 cans are in power operation at the time. So we can choose the secondary loop connects to which can. So can here, we call it can, but you can think that as a reactor itself. So after the secondary heat exchanger cell, there's a steam generator cell, which is called SCC. So here we generate steam, and the steam will go into the BOP. And in the BOP, we have a high pressure turbine, we have an intermediate pressure turbine, we have low pressure turbine, which is very similar to any conventional plant. And of course, we will have a steam reheater. We also have a high pressure feed water heater, low pressure feed water heater. This is all very typical to any power plant, especially those super critical coal power plant. As you can see, the reactor core itself is very small compared to the whole power plant. The majority of the space is actually occupied by the BOP. There's only one interesting thing in the BOP, which is century turbine. We're gonna touch this in the later part of the presentation. But what generally it's doing is supply additional power to the whole power plant when the main turbine is done. So it could either be powered by the steam from the steam generator, or can be powered by a great boiler that powered by either diesel or other means of power. So let's go to the next slide, which you will see from one side. So this is a cutaway from a starboard side. Again, from the left, as you can see here, it may not be very clear, but here's some vessels. Those are the vessels are used to store the used nuclear fuel, which in this case is a used fuel salt. And then there's a cooling tower, which we use a natural circulation of water and air to cool the used fuels tanks. Now, here is the decay heat cooling pond, and we have this decay heat cooling tower. So the decay heat will be transferred by water to this part, which we will have a more detailed image to show how that works. But just remember, here is the location of the decay heat cooling pool, which has a lot of water, and this water can last almost half a year to cool the used fuel without any external power. And underneath the cooling pool, there's a space here which always left empty. It's a ballast space, which if you have additional steam from either the cooling pool or some other place in the nuclear island, the steam can go to this space. So that means you can relieve the pressure from other parts of a power plant without having to release to the atmosphere. Going to the left, as you can see here in blue, is the can. Well, what you actually see here is the can cello wall. The can is actually inside. So just about the size of the can. And then you can see the primary pump, the secondary pump. And then you can see the cello wall actually connected to the decay heat cooling pump. So this is how the water is naturally circulated to cool the fuel inside, even without external power. So here's how the natural circulation is established. We will have another picture that shows this in a close look. In the middle, you can see there's a few salt holding tanks. So every time when the can reaches its lifetime, in this case is 4 years, the fuel salt will be transferred to a new can. But after the fuel salt reaches a lifetime, and it will be drained to this fuel salt hold tank. And the fuel salt hold tank will be cooled by water. During operation, all the space will be submerged into water. So it will be cooled by the natural circulation of water. And once it's cooled for enough time that the used fuel heated low enough, the used fuel will be pumped to these tanks for even longer term storage. So here you can see there's a off-gas hold-up tanks. We'll introduce that later, but the molten salt will always have a cover gas. In our case, it's helium. So all the fission, the gaseous fission products like xenon, krypton will be removed continuously during the operation from the fuel. So it will go through a series of decay, a trap, and eventually it goes to this big tanks, and it will stay there for a very long time and continue to decay in the tanks. And then after that, it will go again to other bottles and tanks for long-term storage. So we're not going to release those fission gas during the operation. It will be stored. So going to the left, you can see the secondary heat exchanger, the steam generator, it's all here. And there's a secondary salt drain tanks at the bottom. Because when we switch the cans or we do any maintenance, we probably need to drain the secondary salt into the secondary salt drain tank. As you can imagine, the primary salt is a fuel, so it's highly radioactive. The secondary salt, it's not radioactive from the very beginning, but since it enters into the can, so it will be irradiated and activated. So it's still radioactive. And then, so once we don't use it, we have to drain it into the secondary salt drain tanks. But the good point is the third loop, the tertiary loop, is not radioactive. And then it goes to the steam generator, so the steam is not radioactive at all, as long as there's no leaks. So again, there's a extra space here, which we use to allow the steam to expand if it has to. To the left, it's all balance of a plant. So you can see there's a thick steel wall to separate each of the cell. So if something happened in one of the cell, it won't affect the other cell. You can see from the side, still the high pressure turbine, low pressure turbine, the generator. Now here again is a century turbine shown here. And you can also see the seawater pumps. So eventually the ultimate heat sink is a seawater. So we let the seawater flow through. And also we can see interesting is that there's a control room here. So the operator will sit in this control room to monitor the status of the whole power plant. As you can see from this image, there's an empty space here and there. So there's quite a lot of a room for us to add extra equipment if it's ever needed. And then we have a crane on top, which can lift all this vault cover and get access to all the components. So everything is replaceable here. And that's the idea of the design. Okay, so, okay, here's a look from the other side, which we call the port side. It's almost similar, so you can get a better picture of the used fuel tanks here. And here's a ballast tank, which really has a lot of space here. So I'll give you a few minutes just to look through this picture. Again, there's a control room. Here is the auxiliary boiler stack. As I mentioned, we have a century turbine, which during the normal operation, it will be powered by the steam. When the main turbine stops, it can still powered by the steam. But if we lose all the steam, the central turbine will be powered by this boiler, and this boiler can be powered by either external electricity or can be powered by diesel. So this one is not a safety system. You know, all the safety systems are powered by either natural are passively operated or powered by some battery power. But this boiler, even though it's not a safety system, but it provides some operational convenience to the operator. Okay, I think this gives you a good overview of the whole power plant. As you can see, the whole power plant looks like a ship, and indeed it is a ship. It will be built in the shipyard, and it will be towed to the deployment site, and then we have ways to let it sit on shore. So the benefit of that is everything can be manufactured in a workshop. So we only have to do a very minimal on-site construction, because as you may heard that a lot of the costs arise, a lot of the schedule delay was caused by the on-site construction, and it will be very challenging to construct a huge nuclear facility in a remote island, but it's relatively easy to do it in the workshop. So everything is done in the workshop, and now this kind of design also have another benefit. It's relatively easy to ensure the security measures. So the whole ship only have very limited access to the external world. It's very easy to defend any hostility from the outside world. Okay, here's a section view, and you can see there's a dimension on it. The total height of the ship is about 33 meters. Of course, you have other chimneys, you have cranes that higher. The total length is here. The waist is not showing here, but the waist is about 67 meters total. It's really a large ship, but compared to a conventional nuclear power plant, it's very compact. From the left, we see the section, the use fuel vault, and then next to it is a cooling pond and a ballast tank. And then here is the most important part of the power plant, the silo hall, which holds the can, which is the reactor itself. And then we have a secondary heat exchanger cell, which is here. And then we have a steam generator cell. So all this belongs to the fission island, which is equivalent to the nuclear, the reactor building of the conventional nuclear power plant. To the right, from here is the BOP. We have large turbine hall. We also have a GIS hall and also control room and other things. And as I mentioned, each of the cell is sealed by 6 stainless steel to prevent any incident, the consequence of any incident to go to impact another cell. Okay, let's take a closer look at the loops. As I mentioned, the reactor is called can, but the core is called pot. We will have a more clear examination of the inside the can in the next slide. But here, just imagine this one is the core. Here is the primary loop, and here's the source of the primary loop. And the temperature, the the highest temperature during a normal operation is 704 degree. It's circulated. Everything here, actually, to the left of here is all in the can. So this part is the reactor part. The primary fuel sort transfer the heat to the secondary sort, and the secondary sort it's very similar to the primary sort, but it doesn't have uranium, doesn't have thorium, it doesn't have all the actinides, and also the ratio of the sodium fluoride and sodium fluoride will be different from the primary sort. And if you notice the pressure here, now here is the pressure, and it is the B is shorthand for bar absolute. So you can see the whole primary loop is operating in a very low pressure, and that helps the design a lot, which we will cover that later. And you can also notice that the pressure in the secondary loop is slightly higher than the primary loop. So what happened is, if there's a leak in the heat exchanger wall and the tube, the secondary sort will leak into the primary sort, and the primary sort is unlikely to leak into the secondary sort. So that means the radioactive material will be retained in the primary loop. It has less chance to migrate to the secondary loop. But we're not stopping here. We're also going to have a third loop, which we call the tertiary loop. It's really just using cheap solar salt, which has been widely used in concentrated solar power plants. And the benefit is, of course, again, the secondary loop, even though it doesn't contain sufficient activated once it gets into the can. However, the third loop, the tertiary loop, is not radioactive. So it's separated from the fuel loop. Once you get to the steam generated side, there's almost no radioactivity. So the steam is not radioactive, which is very important. So that means everything in the balance plant is not radioactive. And even, let's say, if you have primary heat exchanger, and it will have to go through the secondary loop, the tertiary loop, then it can. It's very difficult for any radioactive material to migrate into the steam. And into the steam cycle, you can see the temperature, the steam temperature is about 550, which we can use it as a supercritical steam. It's not extremely high, because nowadays the most advanced coal power plant can have a steam temperature over 600. So all this is very much doable, and you can order those parts almost off the shelf. There's a manufacturer available in the market to supply all these components. And just to remember, this is the modular design. So there's a 2 steam generator. If I can just go back to maybe to this slide. So there's 2 steam generators here, but there's only one set of a turbine. So here we did some adding here. So eventually 517 megawatt electricity powered by 2 steam generators at the same time. And then here is also a very standard supercritical theoretical steam cycle. And we use seawater to cool the condenser. So you can see the numbers here. So I give you a few seconds to just read through this paragraph. I call it energy flow diagram, and it is also a heat transfer diagram, which is the most important part of the design, because the purpose of the power plant is to generate the power. And here shows how this power is generated and transferred eventually to be converted to the electric power. Okay, so let's take a closer look inside the can. So let's start with the, well, maybe we start with the can itself. So here is the core, which we call the port. Now, inside the port, there's a graphite modulator, which contains channels. So the fuel salt can flow through these channels while being moderated by the graphite. Of the pot. In next week's workshop, we'll probably be able to do something on that. We're still working on that. That's, I think, sometimes people has got frustrated why we're not showing what's inside the pot freely, because that was actually restricted by the US export control, which is very annoying, but we have to follow that. We're working actively to confirm what information we can share with the general public. And we had some information on our website, on SOCON's website. I know a lot of experts was able to conduct some analysis based on those published information. And those information are not up to date. So we're trying to release as much up-to-date information as possible so people can all work on that. But hopefully by next Friday, we'll be able to have a better picture on what information can be made available. So the salt flows upward in the port. It's pumped into the pump here. The pump is right here, and you can see on top there's a disc, what we call a header tank. And the salt is then pumped to the heat exchanger through the shell side, the heat exchanger, and it's go back. If you can see the pipe here, go back all the way back to the pot, and then keep circulating during the normal operation. So on top of the pot, you can see several tanks. So this one is what we call off-gas recuperator. How it works is that the molten salt reactor always has cava gas. So in our case, we're using helium. Helium is very good gas because it cannot be activated, so it's not radioactive, and also it's easier to separate the xenon and krypton from helium. If we use argon, the argon will be activated, be radioactive, and also it's hard to separate from other fission gases. So let's say we have this cava gas here. So the cava gas will flow into the off-gas recuperator. It's basically just tanks, and the cava gas stay there for some time, decay there, and release heat. And what's important is the heat is released inside the can. So once the cava gas stayed long enough, it will flow out of the recuperator to some other off-gas managing devices outside the can. The gas is already cooled down, so it's much easier to handle those gases. There's a off-gas hold up tank, which we have just seen a few slides early, and those those cans are much bigger and will hold the off gas from here. And then on this side, we have the makeup fuel tank because we're using liquid fuel. So we have the luxury of continuously adding extra fissile material to the core. So we don't need to have excessive reactivity, and so we don't need to have those mechanism to compensate those excessive reactivity. What we do is whenever we need some extra fissile material, we just push some salt from the makeup fuel tank into the core. But what about the fuel that's already in the pot? We have to push out some of the old fuel, right? So the old fuel will be pushed out from the pump and header tank and all the way back to the fuel drain tank. So and then we also have thorium tank, which allow us to add thorium into the core. So here's basically the top. Oh, there's two valves that you can see here. That is the secondary loop. So secondary loop has to flow into the can in the tube side of the heat exchanger to transfer the heat. But whenever we have to, say, replace the whole can, we cut off the valve here and we remove all this can in the hole. So here's actually the can in red, and the can is the boundary, is the barrier against radioactive material release. So you can see it completely surrounds the pod, primary heat exchanger, the pump, and several of the tanks here. And underneath the primary loop, there's a freeze valve, and I don't know if you can see it clearly, but there should be 4 freeze valves in parallel. So we only need 1 freeze valve to be functional. So the function of the freeze valve is that you can drain all the fuel salt into the drain tanks. So while we're draining it, first of all, during the normal operation, when you want to replace the can, you want to first drain the fuel salt, so you can actively open the freeze valve. What the freeze valve works is that you supply cold, you supply cooling to the freeze valve, so the salt will become solid. It will form a shut-off valve by itself. But once you remove the cooling, the heat of the fuel salt will melt and then will flow into the fuel drain tanks. And also during the emergency, if ever you want to drain the salt, you can just cut off the power and the heat will just melt the solid part, and the salt will be drained into the fuel drain tank by gravity. So you need power to keep the freeze valve freezing, but you don't need the power to melt it. You don't need the power to drain it. It's completely passive. So you can see the fuel salt drain tank is connected to the can. So when you replace the can, you will replace the fuel drain tanks as well. All this can and the fuel drain tanks are surrounded by the cold wall, which is also the can silo, which is double wall, and the water is filled inside, and the water is circulated naturally to remove the heat. So that's especially important when we lost the power. And when we lost the power, the freeze valve will open, and all the salt will be drained into the fuel drink tank, and then the fuel drink tank will be cooled by the cold water naturally, by the natural circulation of water. Okay, so when you replace the can and the fuel cell drink tank, you won't replace the cold water. The cold water stays with the power plant. Okay, so here's just a explanation on how the primary loop and fuel cell tanks works. If you look at the number, the output for each of the pod is about 557 megawatt thermal, and here's the fuel salt, which we have sodium fluoride, beryllium fluoride, zirconium fluoride, uranium, and thorium fluoride. The reason we're adding the zirconium fluoride is to reduce the corrosion and to prevent uranium from forming uranium oxides. Our enrichment is 17.75% of uranium-235, and the moderator is graphite. The structural material is stainless steel. Here's outlet temperature, inlet temperature. The fuel boiling temperature is about 1400. Now I'm using this approximate number because as you can imagine, during the operation, when the burn-up changes, the fuel salt will change. You'll have more efficient products actinized at the end of the cycle. So that means the salt properties, including the boiling temperature, will change slightly over the time. So it's about this number. And then the fuel liquidator temperature is around 500. So, but either way, you see there's a big margin between the normal operating temperature and boiling temperature. And there's also some margin between the lowest operating temperature and the liquidator's temperature. So we got the margins here. Now, the operating time at this moment for the can and fuel drink tank is 4 years. So every 4 years, we will replace the can with the fuel salt drink tank. The fuel salt, however, can operate longer. It could be 8 years. So we're not replacing the fuel salt every 4 years. And exactly how we optimize that, we can still keep doing that, and maybe we can have a longer fuel salt lifetime. Okay. So after introducing the general concept of the SOCON 500, I'd like to use one slide to review the ThorCon safety philosophy. So ThorCon safety philosophy is based on the 3 C's, which we call control, cool, and contain. And that is actually consistent with the IAEA fundamental safety functions. The IAEA defined the fundamental safety functions as control of reactivity, cooling of radioactive material, confinement of radioactive material. So those are corresponding to the 3 C's that ThorCon is using. So, we all know the 3 C's or the fundamental safety functions are extremely important, but how do we achieve that? And there's several ways of doing that. You can do that by using inherent safety, like basic or fundamental physics laws. Also, you can implement passive or active safety systems, which a lot of people are using it. And you can also rely on human actions. So you give your operator extensive training, and you design system that easy for them to make decisions and taking actions. They will be required to do the right thing whenever an emergency happens. But ThorCon is relying on the former two ways to achieve the 3 Cs. So ThorCon relies on inherent safety features and passive and active safety systems to achieve this, the safety functions. ThorCon does not intend to rely on human actions, so that will relieve the operators quite a lot. And we can, so in the next several slides, let's just examine how ThorCon intends to achieve that. Okay, so we can start with a review of the safety features of molten salt in general. So in general, molten salt, especially the fluoride salt and chloride salt, they all have relatively high boiling temperature. And when you have different type of a salt, the boiling temperature may vary. But for ThorCon salt, it's about 1400 C, which you can find a reference here, which gives you the boiling temperature and other properties for all kinds of salt. So because you have a high boiling temperature, you will be able to use a low pressure design, because during the normal operation, the temperature is about 700 or even 800, the salt is always liquid. So you don't have to pressurize the system to maintain it to be liquid. And you have to do that in the light water reactor. So that's a advantage of using molten salt, because the system will have less chance to break. And also the system will have a slow accident progression, because if you have a high pressure system, when you have a leak, the pressure in that system will decrease. But once it decrease, the boiling effect will increase. So that kind of accelerate the accident, but that doesn't exist in using molten salt. Also, there's less energy to disperse the radioactive material. Imagine you have a high pressure system, you have a small break, you will have things that burst to the outside world. But for molten salt, because you don't have a pressure, so even you have a small leak, you won't have the energy to push all the stuff out. The accident is the kind of quiet compared to the high pressure system. The high boiling temperature also provide a large temperature margin, because the boiling temperature is around 1400, while the operating temperature is 700. So you have 700 degrees C margin. You can allow the system to heat up, like say 100 degree or even 200 degree. It won't cause a big issue there. The salt also has some favorable chemical properties, especially for the ThorCon salt. So all I'm mentioning here is really closely related to the ThorCon salts. First of all, there's no violent reactions with air, water, and everything. And I'm saying that because there's other low pressure system. For example, the sodium cooled fast reactor. They're using liquid sodium as a coolant, which also have a low pressure system. But the sodium will react violently with oxygen. So once you get a leak, the air gets in or water gets in, you will have a very violent reaction. You can have fire. But for molten sword, even if you expose to air and water, there's no fire hazard. It doesn't produce flammable or explosive gases, which you have observed in some of the accidents. The water at high temperature can react violently with zirconium to generate hydrogen. There's no such mechanism in molten sword. So even though molten sword is corrosive in some of the situation, but it doesn't react violently. Their reaction is relatively slow. It's a long-term phenomenon. It doesn't cause an accident in the short term. And also the fluoride sword tends to form stable compounds with elements such as cesium and also strontium. And those elements are extremely important when considering the doses that's caused by a nuclear accident. And unfortunately, these alkalines and other volatile elements will react with fluoride and it will stay in the sword. So it's relatively stable. And also the dissolvability of those elements are relatively high in the molten sword and compared to the solid. So a lot of the elements that are contributing to the doses will stay in the sword instead of being released to the environment. And now I'm not saying all the elements can stay in the sword. There are still elements that will be released from the sword, which we have engineering measures to control those elements. Finally, the molten sword are chemically stable when irradiated. That's important, but that's only true for fluoride and to some extent to chloride. The natrium sword will not be stable when irradiated. And also it's a molten sword reactor when it's molten. When a sword is molten, it's liquid. So there's several advantages for being liquid. We can do online off-gas removal. So that means during the normal operation, we can remove those elements that are not stable in the molten sword. For example, the noble gases, the xenons and the kryptons, some of the iodine can also be removed. So that means there's less accumulation of volatile fission products in the field. That means if you have an accident, you have less volatile fission products to be released to the environment. And you cannot do that for most of the solid fuel because they are sealed in the zirconium cladding or stainless steel cladding. In that case, there's no way to remove the fission gases from the solid fuel. And also the liquid fuel allows the online fuel addition. So that results in less excessive reactivity, which we had just talked about in the previous slide. In general, the molten sword, especially the fluoride sword, has a large thermal capacity. So that means when temperature, so the temperature will increase slower compared to the coolant fuel that has less thermal capacity. So when temperature increase slower, that usually means the accident will develop relatively slowly. Okay, so having all those features in mind, how did SOCON 500 achieve all those safety functions, or the 3Cs? So let's start with the first one, the control, which means the control of reactivity. So ThorCon basically has 3 independent methods to control that. First of all, it has a negative temperature coefficient of reactivity. Now, I have to highlight here is that what we're saying here is that SOCON 500 has a negative total temperature coefficient of reactivity. It doesn't mean that every piece of the coefficient of reactivity is negative, but the total value, adding all this effect, the total value will always be negative enough. And then SOCON 500 also have shutdown rods, which is a traditional way of shutting down a reactor, which is very reliable. And then SOCON also has the freeze valve and drain tank. As you remember, once the freeze valve is open, the salt will be drained into the drain tank. In the drain tank, because of the geometry of the drain tank, there's no way for the salt to maintain criticality. But if you compare it to the 3rd generation of light water reactor, the LWR also take advantage of the negative temperature coefficient of reactivity. And now, again, in LWR, the negative coefficient of reactivity is also means the total negative. The total coefficient of reactivity is negative. If you consider some of the PWR during when they're using fresh fuel, they have to inject boric acid into the coolant. So in that situation, the void coefficient of reactivity can be positive during some of the time at a certain temperature, but overall it will be negative. And another example is the CANDU heavy water reactor. The void coefficient of CANDU reactor is always slightly positive, but again, the total reactivity coefficient is always negative. So that's very similar. So both SOCON 500 and LWR are take advantage of the total negative temperature coefficient of reactivity. And they also both have shutdown rods. The difference is in the 3rd method. LWR usually will, if all this, if shutdown rods fail, they will inject neutron poisons into the coolant, while what SOCON will do is to drain the fuel salt into the drain tanks. Okay. Here's how the drain tanks looks like. Here's a closer look. There's the freeze valve, and then here all the drain tanks here. So as I mentioned, when the temperature rises, it will open the freeze valve automatically. It doesn't require any actions. And the fuel salt flows into the drain tank by gravity. Again, it doesn't need any power. And the geometry of the drain tank will ensure the subcriticality. So how does it work? Let's take a more closer look. So the idea of using freeze valve in a nuclear reactor was from the Oak Ridge MSRE effort. As you can see, here's a test of the freeze valve, and here's the real freeze valve. Those are all the pictures here. And now here's the drain tank of MSRE. And what you see here is the steam tubes that used to cool the drink tanks, while SOCON is now using the steam tubes. Instead, SOCON is using cold wall that surrounding the drink tank. So the drink tanks has been tested in MSRE during the operation, and also during the time before and after the MSRE. And again, SOCON is also intend to test it in its pre-efficient test bed. Okay, so how do we achieve cool? So first of all, the SOCON 500, during the normal operation, it has a normal residue heat removal powered by the centric turbine. As I mentioned, it's not a safety system, but it gives you the convenience, so you don't have to always to rely on your system to achieve some of the functions. But if you lose that, say if you lose either diesel power or electric power or anything, then you can use the cold wall and cooling pump, which can cool the fuel for 145 days without any rate or diesel power, which is very long time, and it so you have enough time to take actions. And then if all the above fails, the basement water and the ballast tank can cool the fuel for 269 days without any rate or diesel power. So that's a very long time. Once you reach 269 days, the decay heat will be low enough. So you probably won't need any water to cool it. You can just, the air circulation may be enough to keep cooling them. So let's compare it to the LWR, the third generation LWR. Again, all the LWR has a normal residue heat removal system powered by either the grid or diesel. So that's very similar to what SOCON has. And then for LWR, you have a very complicated emergency core cooling system. Just because LWR is a high pressure system. So once you start to lose your coolant, it's hard to inject water into the system because the pressure is so high. Usually you will have to have a high pressure injection, intermediate pressure injection, and low pressure injection. So the system is quite complicated. With all things adding together, you probably gonna have a 3 days without power. So that means you have to either restore the power or do something else within those 3 days. While the SOCON 500 can go to either 145 days or 269 days. So it's gonna give the operator a very, very long time to take action. And by the end of 269 days, the fuel is gonna be cool enough. It probably don't have to take any action. But our analysis and test will validate these numbers. So let's look at the centric turbine here. So each SOCON 500 will have a 15 megawatt electric centric turbo generator and a 50 megawatt thermal auxiliary boiler. So during the normal operation, the centric turbine is always on. It receives steam from the steam generator. So there is a bypass of the steam that not going to the main turbine. It goes to the centric turbine. So it's always on. The reason it's always on is you don't have to start it. So usually the equipment will fail during the startup. So since the turbine is always on, when the accident happens, you don't have to start it. It's always on. So after the reactor is shut down, the decay heat will continue to generate steam in the steam generator, and it can keep the central turbine run for several hours. But when the decay heat is low, the steam will stop. Then in this case, the auxiliary boiler will be used to support the central turbine. If the external power is still there, then the auxiliary boiler can just use the external power. If the power is lost, then the boiler will have to use the diesel that's stored on board. But all this system I'm mentioning here is not a safety system. It gives you operational convenience. So what if we don't have any external power, and for some reason the central turbine is not running, and we have the safety system to keep cooling the fuel, what we call the cold wall and cooling pump. So here's the cold wall. As you can see, the can is inside, and then you can see the water is filled in the cold wall. The heat from the can and from the fuel drink tanks will be radiated to the cold wall, and there will also be some convection and conduction, but the dominant way of transferring heat here is radiation. So I mean heat radiation. So the water in the cold wall is warmed up and will flow into a heat exchanger that's set in the cooling pool, which I will show it in the next slide. And once it's cooled, it will go back to the cold wall, and there's a natural circulation of water. So let's just go to the next slide. That might be easier to explain. So as I mentioned, the water is heated up in the cold wall, and then it flows to the expansion tank and to a heat exchanger that is underneath the decay heat pump. Once it cools down, it goes back to the cold wall. So that's how the natural circulation is established. But what if the natural circulation is not formed for whatever reason? Either the decay heat pump is dry, or the water is not circulating. So in that case, the water in the cold wall will be heated up. And the good news is the whole basement, the whole cell is filled with water. So the cold wall can transfer the heat to all the waters in the basement, and the water will be heated up. When water heats up, it will generate steam. So the steam will expand to the ballast tank here. And based on the calculation, the water in the basement can cool the fuel for 269 days. So that's a long time. Again, as you can see, a lot of other basements all flood with water. So there's enough cooling there. There's nothing to worry about. Okay, so how do we know that the cold wall will work? Because the cold wall is not a complete new technology. It has been adopted in other advanced reactors. For example, in the high temperature gas cool reactor, they use Cold War to cool their vessels when they lose power. One of the example is the commercial high temperature gas reactor HTR PM, which is under construction. So I got references here. If you're interested, you can take a look at that nuclear power plant. And the other example is the SINAP, the Chinese molten salt test reactor, is also using the Cold War technology. So once this test is up running, we have some information on how that Cold War works for the test reactor. But I think most importantly, the commercial use of Cold War in the gas-cooled nuclear power plant is very convincing. Okay, so the last function, not the least function, is the contain. How do we contain or confine the nuclear material inside the plant without letting it be released to the environment? So in terms of containing or confining radioactive material, we have to first look at the fuel itself, because fuel is also the first barrier of radioactive release. And for SOCON 500, the fluoride salt fuel is the first barrier, which is also a chemical barrier. For a typical LWR, the oxide fuel matrix is the barrier. And fluoride salt has a much better performance compared to the oxide fuel matrix. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the fuel salt can contains the cesium, strontium, those alkaline metals. It also contains a lot of other chemical compounds in the molten salt. And for the elements like noble gases and some of the iodine that cannot be contained in the fuel salt, it will be continuously removed from the fuel salt. So there's a very little chance for the radioactive material to be released from the fuel salt during the accidents. And those are the chemical features, but there's also physical barriers. So the first physical barrier for SOCON 500 is the stainless steel can and the fuel drink tank. Noting that the pot is not the first barrier. The stainless steel can is, and then the can and the fuel drink tank is surrounded by the stainless steel can silo, which is also sealed. It's a second physical barrier. And the third one is the stainless steel can silo hull, so which also called the can silo cell. It's a stainless steel cell that's leak tight. So on top of the fuel salt, there's three physical barriers against the release of radioactive material. Comparing to the generation 3 LWRs, the LWR also have multiple physical barriers. The zirconium alloy fuel cladding is the first one. The second one is stainless steel pressure boundary, and then you have a stainless steel containment shell. So LWR also have three physical barriers. Okay, so let's talk about the fuel salt and off gas first. There's a study that has been done since the 60s, 70s, and also the recent study has been done here to study how good the fluid salt is to contain those important fission products like cesium and iodine. What they're important because they're easy to be released. They contribute to the personal dose more significantly than other elements. Plutonium is a very sensitive element, but in terms of contribution to personal dose, it's relatively small because it's not easy to disperse plutonium, while it's much easier to disperse cesium, iodine, and noble gases. So we're paying a lot of attention to these volatile elements. So those are the lessons learned from the past nuclear accidents. All these studies show that the fluoride salt has a good capability of containing those dangerous, easy to disperse elements. The SOCON 500 off-gas system continues to remove fission gases and turpentine and xenon from the fuel during normal operation. So the situation is that those elements that can be chemically bound or dissolved in the salt will remain there. Those cannot be bound, cannot be dissolved, will be removed during the normal operation. So when an accident happens, the radioactive material that are ready to be released are very limited. So those are the, this is a very important feature for using salt as a fuel. And even with that, the SOCON 500 still have multiple steel barriers, as I mentioned. Here is a picture. This one is a can, which is the first barrier, the physical barrier. And here's the drain tank. It's also the first physical barrier. And it's made of 25 to 50 millimeter steel, and it's leak tight and it can be tested. The second one is the Cancelo, which Cold War is part of it, and also including the red tank and Cold War. They're forming the second barrier. It's often made of 25 to 30 millimeter steel layers, and in some cases they got multiple layers. The third physical barrier is the cell. So as you can see, each cell, actually not only the Cancelo cell, but all the cells have doubled or tripled steel layers. Here's the bottom one, the side, and the top. So each of this, it's the third barrier, which is made of a double 25 millimeter steel layered with 3 meter concrete in the middle. So the purpose of the concrete is not only for shielding, for strength, but also will defend against external impact. Okay, so I have covered everything I like to cover. I got all this reference here. So hopefully, if you're interested, you can look at those references. But for this workshop, I'm ready for any questions.
Okay, thank you, Kun. So questions, everybody, anybody?
Hello.
Yes.
Could I have a question, please?
Yes, please. Go
Sure.
ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Kun. It's very interesting.
Could you introduce yourself, Pak Dedi? Could you introduce yourself?
Oh yeah, my name Dedi Setiawan. I'm working for Bapeten for safety analysis for research reactor.
Okay.
Yeah, interesting because you also said that about the wall code. You mentioned that it is similar with the HDR. And yeah, I have a little experience with the HDR. The reason why the HDR has the radioactive heat transfer because they use a large graphite and also combined with the carbon. But in this type of reactor, I didn't see. I see about the graphite, but I don't know. But in my opinion, this is not too much. This is too too little. So comparing with the HDR, this is the first question for me because this is interesting because in my opinion, radiative heat transfer is very important, very significant for the accident analysis in the high temperature reactor like this. And then you mentioned also in SMR, you use this cooling also for the radiative. And
Yes.
then the second question is it okay? Second question, please. Yeah, the second question is, do you have any scenario for the accident? Like in HDR, we have the worst case scenario like air ingress or water ingress, because this is related with the chemical analysis. Like I am sure that for the SMR also have the worst case accident scenario. Right? This is the second question. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Kun, do you understand the question?
Yes, thank you very much
Okay.
for the questions. So the first question is about the comparison to the HDR. So I'm comparing these two for two reasons. The first one is they're both high temperature reactor. So at a high temperature, the heat radiation plays a very important role in the heat transfer, especially during the accidents when you lose the forced circulation. What happens in SOCON 500 is that the spaces that in the can or in the primary loop will also be filled with helium. So we're not relying on the heat conduction. We're not relying on the convection of helium during the accident. So we're making a very conservative assumption that they're stable. The heat conduction is minimal. So we're relying on radiation to transfer the heat from the can, from primary loop, from the fuel to the Cold War, where in the Cold War you have a water natural circulation. So once you can get the heat to the water, we'll be fine. And those conclusions and calculations are currently based on analysis. And we understand completely that those analyses need to be validated. So the most direct way of doing that is to build a full-scale model, a full-scale test bed that we're calling it the coefficient tester platform, or PTP. So in that facility, we're going to test, we're going to validate the analysis. But currently, our analysis shown that the heat will be transferred to the Cold War through radiation. And I'm comparing also because some of the HGR, like the one under construction in China, they also have this similar Cold War concept. We have water pipes inside the concrete wall, and to cool the wall. So that's why I make the comparison. For the second question, do we have a list of accidents, and among them, do we have abounding accidents or the worst case accidents? So we do have a list of accidents over the past 10 years, or even before that. The MSR community has formed a list of PIEs, or list of internal external hazards for MSR. Those can be found from the references, which I'm also planning to introduce them in the in week 6. We have a session on safety assessment. So, but going back to the worst case scenario, the bonding accidents, it really depends on the design of the reactor. So each molten salt reactor may have its own worst case scenario. The reason is there's a big variety in molten salt reactor compared to HDGR. In our first workshop, we reviewed the taxonomy of MSR. We can see there's all kinds of different MSRs. So I can give you an example. For example, the test reactor that is under construction in China, their worst case is that they have a leak in their cover gas system. So they just incidentally release the cover gas into the environment. So it's not actually the loss of coolant or reactivity excursion. It's the leak of cover gas system. But that's only true for that particular type of MSR. For ThorCon 500, we have list all the PIEs. We still have to complete our safety assessment to identify which action is a bonding case, which one is it's the worst scenario. I hope I answered your questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Kun. Yeah, because maybe I'm more interesting use for the graphite, because the reason why HDR use the graphite, because they need the radiation heat transfer. And then why use graphite? Because the emissivity of graphite, and also because they use also combine not only graphite but also with carbon brick and then another carbon. This is the reason why they are very sure that the radiative heat transfer will be working. But in this, sorry, Professor, because honestly I didn't see the graphite is not enough in my opinion. But interesting, maybe we can also use the calculation validation or something like experimental data for this. Okay, by the way, it's very interesting for me to know about the SMR. Thank you very much, Professor.
Okay, Kun, there is
a
question written in the chat here from Professor Sharif from Batan. He says, based on the overall schematic drawing of the MSR system, it can be seen that the refueling requires barge, which means that it requires a water line. Does this mean MSR has to be built on the beach? Second, how do you maintain low pressure in the system?
Okay, so yes, I also see that question in the chart session. So the first question, up to this point, we're thinking about building the SOCON 500 very close to water. At least we got access to water. That's what I'm showing today. There may be other thinking, but our focus right now, our first demonstration reactor is going to be by the shore. So maybe Bob, you have a more comprehensive understanding of about the future deployment, but for the first one, it's gonna be next to the water. And the second question is how do you maintain low pressure in the system? So we do not have to pressurize the system because the molten salt fuel and coolant have a very high boiling temperature. So theoretically, we don't need any pressure, and the pressure you see in the loop is because we still have pump. So when we pump salt, it will generate some pressure. So that's only, and also of course we have a gravity. So if you have a heavy salt, you have a tall vessel, you will have a pressure at the bottom. But those are all the reasons we introduce pressure. We do not intentionally pressurize our system because we have no needs for that.
Kun, I think on the question one, I think what he meant was probably that built, meaning that I think it's construction. I think we are going to construct it in the shipyard, right? And install it in on the shoreline. So Pak Sharif, we're not going to construct it in the shoreline, but construct and build it on the shipyard and tow it to the shoreline, to the place where we are putting it, maybe on an island for the first one. So Pak Sharif, is that satisfy?
Yes, thank you. That is very suitable for our country.
Okay, very good. So the next question on the chat room, Kun, from Muhammad Rifki.
Okay, so the question is, with the stated safety feature, how would it affect the core damage frequency and large release frequency value for the TMSR 500? Okay, the first question about the core damage frequency, it is a, I mean, the MSR community and the regulators have in both US and Canada, also the China and IEA, we both recognize that the core damage frequency is not a adequate term, or not the right term for this kind of MSR, because the fuel source is always molten, and the core damage frequency that was defined in the LWR, it's talking about the fuel damage. And in our case, we don't have this phenomenon. So I have seen people have done PSA on MSR. They usually don't pay attention to the core damage frequency. And what's important for MSR is the large release frequency. And so basically, you have to analyze all these accidents for MSR, and then you calculate the large release frequency. It's not very, I mean, the methodology is there, but the practice hasn't been completed, or we have seen academic studies on that, but really there hasn't been a case that approved by the regulator to say, okay, here's a model you can use, and everybody is doing the calculation by themselves. So generally, the large release frequency value is believed to be very low. The challenge is the exact value the community hadn't really reached a consensus on how to obtain that value. So to summarize what I just said, the core damage frequency is not relevant for SOCON 500. The large release frequency is relevant, but there hasn't been a consensus in the community on how to I don't know if that answered your question.
Okay, hopefully it does. Oke, Mas Muhammad Rifki, nanti kalau ada pertanyaan lagi follow up di chat aja tulis ya. Nah, next one is Dr. Sidik Permana. He has raised the hand. Pak Sidik, please ask your questions.
Okay, thank you, Pak Bob. Thank you, Dr. Kun. So, could you please show us again the comparison between the TMSR and the LWR regarding the control reactivity?
Okay, let me reshare my screen. So control of reactivity. Yeah, this one, right?
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So the stop down rod and also principal. But I think as far I know, the flow fuel also can be used for the control.
I think you are breaking apart, Pak Sidik. We cannot hear.
Hello. Check.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
all right,
yeah.
we're hearing you.
Okay.
We didn't hear you before.
Okay.
You, repeat your questions.
Okay. As far I know, the flow fuel salt in the reactor also can be used as the control stability. I mean, the reactivity in the core. I mean, if we set the flow slower, you have the fission rate and also the reactivity can be increased. And if we give the flow salt in the reactor faster, maybe less reactivity can be happen. So I think the other control also can be used by the the flow rate, the flow of a fuel, because the pump, I think the active pump from the to control the circulation of the fuel salt also can be used for the control reactivity. Yeah, just for the about your opinion. And then the other reactivity also, yeah, of course, the draining process for the regular process we can use to dry the reactor, and then how to say the stop the reactor and then dry it into the drying tank. But in the accident also can be used for the safety control for the accident. It is likely similar for the nowadays. Maybe this stability can also has been introduced for the advanced LWR as similar to core catcher. Maybe as you know, the EPR also introduced the core catcher for the yes, seem likely the draining process from the core into the draining bottom the core vessel. So in comparison, TMSR and LWR for the draining process, maybe we can use for the just for the additional information about the comparison. Okay, and the other related to the draining condition for the safety analysis, do you have any data for the how fast the draining time when the process happen? Because it will be how fast the reactor increase the reactivity when the accident happen, and then how fast the fuel salt in the reactor go through bottom the draining process. Maybe you have the data to estimate the condition. And the last question, sorry, the other questions. The reactor circulate from the core to outer core in the first primary circulation loop of the fuel salt. In that sense, from the core and the big can go through the circulation loop outside the core, we need to separate, divide it into how many loop outside from the reactor core into outside? 4, or I forgot, I not mentioned the previous presentation. Do you catch my question? And the last question?
Yes. I think I catch the question 1, 2, and 3. I don't think I fully understood the last question. Are you asking how many loops we have?
Yes. From the from the core, and then to separate into the outer core in the primary loop. So you need to separate it into how many?
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. So for the first one, have we considered using the flow rate as a mean of controlling reactivity? So because there's a delay neutron effect, so every time we circulate the fuel, the delay neutron will be removed out of the core, and depending on how fast we're removing the delay neutron, the reactivity will change. Yes, we have analyzed those situations. However, at this time, we're treating those delay neutron phenomena as a path-related initiating event. So we're considering, let's say, we have a pump malfunction, either runs faster or slower than we expected, or sometimes it completely stops. That will change the reactivity in the core. And so we consider those as a phenomenon. We did analysis to accommodate that, but we haven't really used that as a way to control the reactivity. Maybe we can consider that, but at this point in the design, we're not using that feature to control the reactivity. We're analyzing it as a phenomenon. So that's for the first question. The second one is, yes, the core catch. The LWR has a core catch when you have the everything melted and melted through, you have a catch. The difference from the core catch and the SOCON 500 drain tank is that the drain tank is totally under control. So once the salt is drained to the tank, it can be transferred out of the tank to other places like fuel storage tank, or even can be pumped back to the pot, and it's totally under control. While the core catch, once you catch it, it's almost impossible to return it back to the core to reuse it. And I think that's a main difference there. But I agree with you. It looks similar to the core catch of the LWR. The third question is about the drain time. So our current analysis show that from the start of the drain to the end of the drain, it takes about 10 minutes. The reason we think 10 minutes is adequate is because, first of all, we have a total a negative temperature coefficient of reactivity, and the graphite and the salt has a relatively large thermal capacity. So the temperature rises slowly, and the reactivity goes down slowly. So we don't need to drain this very fast. And second reason is that once you start to drain, the reactivity will go down. So it will already have an impact on control the reactivity. So our current analysis show that the 10 minutes drain time and the design of the freeze valve and drain tanks are adequate to handle those accidents. Of course, we can introduce more details in the week 6 of this workshop. The last question, so how many loops? We only have one loop. For each can, we only have one primary loop in the can. Yeah, that's
okay.
I don't know if I have answered your question.
Thank you, Kun.
Thank you. So the next one we have Dia. We answered Dia Hidayanti. So then after Dia, we have 3 questions on the chat room. So we go to the chat room, Kun. So Budia, please introduce yourself and ask your questions.
Okay, thank you, Pak Bob, for the chance. My name is Dia. I'm from Bapeten. Mr. Kun, I have 2 questions. The first one is simple. How do you determine the physical properties, thermal properties of the fuel salt? Because we know that the properties of the salt used in ThorCon design is not well informed. We have to find it from the experiments, of course. And then the second question, I am interested in freeze valve. We know that freeze valve is the most, I think, the important component in the MSR safety, and the reliability of the freeze valve is the important question in the design. If the freeze valve is failed to work, for example, it failed to melt, to thaw, what happened? Do the shutdown rod is enough to replace the function of freeze valve to stop the criticality of the salt? And if the freeze valve is failed to freeze, I mean, if there is a serious melting when the reactor in operation, I think it will also disturb the operation, because it will take time. It's time consuming to return the salt from the drain tank to the pot, to the primary loop. And then about the reliability of the freeze valve, to increase the reliability, why don't you consider to add the number of freeze valve? I mean, use the multiple freeze valve. So if you have the failure in one freeze valve, for example, there is a blockage in the pipe, so salt cannot go down to the drain tank. So you still have another freeze valve. You have another pipe to drain the salt to the drain tank. Okay, that's all. Enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Budia.
All right. Thank you very much for the question. Those are excellent questions. The first one, yes. So the physical and chemical properties of the salt are extremely important. And what's more important is that the property of the salt will change with the change of burnup, because the composition of the salt will change. You have more efficient product actinides. And what you can find in the literature, and they only measure the pure salt. People have measured all compositions of the salt throughout the life cycle of the fuel. So what SOCON is going to do is to measure the thermophysical property of the salt throughout the life cycle, the different composition. And we have found labs in the US and someone else to do the measurement. They're very experienced labs. They have been measured this salt properties for about 10 years. And we actually got several several labs. So our strategy is to let a multiple lab to do the salt quality measurement, so we can compare. If they agree, then we have the confidence that we have the accurate value. So, and also in the design, we will accommodate the uncertainty of the properties of the salt. We will leave adequate margin to address the variation or uncertainty of the property. We're confident that with the combination of both multiple measurements and the conservative design, we'll be able to address this issue. Of course, we're gonna make those information available to Babaton and other organizations, and that's gonna be coming very soon. And the second question about the freeze valve. So our confidence on the freeze valve was from the MSRE. They have done extensive testing with good records, and over their 4-year operation, their freeze valve did not accidentally open. So everything seems to be okay, but I totally agree with what you said. The experiment occurred down, even though for many years was like 50 years ago. SOCON will do extensive tests to demonstrate that the freeze valve will work. That must be done, and that's in our plan. Again, we'll make the plan and result available to Babaton. And your recommendation on using multiple valves is an excellent idea. We actually are thinking about that. We're currently thinking using 4 freeze valves in parallel, but the image that I just shown, it's not showing clearly the 4 valves. I think it shows some part, but due to the cutting of the image, it doesn't show the whole picture. But we are thinking using 4 freeze valves in parallel. So what if it still fails? Let's say the 4 valves, for some reason, they all failed. What's going to happen? What's going to happen is in the primary loop, we intentionally make the bottom of the loop weaker than the rest part of the loop. So if temperature keeps rising, the freeze valve is not open, the bottom of the loop will melt. So it's more like a LWR melting penetration. So the bottom will be penetrated, and the fuel salt will be leaked from the bottom of the primary loop and will flow into the filtering tank. So the drain can still happen. Yeah, those are my answers. Hopefully address your question.
Okay, cukup Bu Dia? Is that sufficient? Okay,
yes, enough.
Good.
Thank
Right,
you.
now Kun, we go to the chat room.
Yes.
Yes. So the last time we go to Nur Samshi. Oh no, Farid Nur. What is the worst scenario for TSMR 500? 500 worst scenario design. What is the worst scenario for TSMR 500 design?
Okay. This question must be answered. At this point, we're doing our safety assessment to identify the worst scenario. So we haven't got a solid conclusion on which one is the worst, but we have got the list of PIEs. Once we complete our safety assessment, we'll be able to answer that question.
Okay, right. So the next one for Nur Samsi Sam. Dear Professor.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So the question is, since ThorCon used liquid fuel, how to control the composition changes, which is not only caused by irradiation, but possibly also by the chemistry of the system, and how the composition change is considered in certain transient or accident scenario. So that's the first question. Yes, so we recognize that the composition change is extremely important. As I just answered the last question, we have to measure all the thermal physical properties and also chemical properties of the sword with all possible compositions. And once we have that, we can design the system accordingly to accommodate all these possible scenarios. So I think that's the key thing, as Dia has just pointed out, that the properties of the sword is extremely important. But with that, we still have to maintain the chemistry control of the fuel sword. And we do have ways of doing that. And I think in the next several weeks, we can start to introduce those concepts. So basically, two ways, a combination of accurate sword property and the online or in operation control of chemistry will be able to address the concerns that you just raised. And so the second question was, I didn't see tritium in your explanation on off gas. How significant tritium can be produced from neutron reaction with fluorine? Yes, so compared to the MSRE and all other MSR that are using lithium, so our sword produce significantly less tritium compared to others, but there's still tritium generated in the system. The reason that we have several loops, we have a primary loop, secondary loop, and tertiary loop. The part of the reason for doing that is to separate tritium from the steam cycle. I didn't explicitly mention tritium, but the loops were set up that you have a separation from the fuel to the steam. So the system will be implemented in the secondary loop and tertiary loop to capture the tritium. But the challenge is really, the tritium does not go to the area you want them to go. At high temperature, the tritium will have will be capable of penetrate steel and go to some other places. But we have compared the tritium production from fluorine to the heavy water reactor, such as CANDU reactor, and our tritium generation will be much less than them. So we're confident that we will be able to meet the regulatory requirement on tritium release.
Okay, next one is from Pak Andam.
Okay, so yeah, so next question. Okay, the first question is how to move back the fuel to the primary system after draining to the fuel drain tank. Okay, so I probably can introduce more in week 4 when we talk about operation. But in general, what happened is that you can see there's a small tank on top of the drain tank. I don't know if you can remember that, but we basically use helium gas to push the sword out of the drain tank, and then first to that small tank, then next step to another tank that is on top of the pot, which is not shown here, but we do have that system. And the idea is to use the helium gas to push the sword around. So that's how we drain it. Well, not actually drain it, but actually push it or transfer it from the fuel drain tank. But once it push it out, it can be refilled to the header tank of the pump. Okay. So second question: what about the availability of beryllium due to beryllium is a rare material? Yes. So beryllium is relatively rare. If you study the supply of beryllium, you will find that 80% of the beryllium is produced in the US, and 18% of beryllium is supplied in China, and the rest of the world actually produce about 2% of beryllium, mainly from Kazakhstan and Russia. But even with that, we were able to identify multiple suppliers, both in the US and in China, who are willing to supply high purity beryllium fluoride with a reasonable cost. And they can supply sword with hundreds of tons, which is adequate for our use in the demonstration reactor. So we have a fully confidence in procuring beryllium from suppliers, and they're actually sending samples to us. Our labs are doing testing of those samples to confirm the impurity of the sword. The third question: what is the reason to design the replaceable primary system rather than long life? I think the replaceable design will need more material and may produce more waste, meaning spent fuel. Okay, so the reason we want to replace it, because the main thing is because the graphite. As you may know, that the graphite under radiation will start to expand, and after a certain point, it will shrink. So it's very hard to manage that. And we say, instead of trying to manage that, we give it a shorter design lifetime. Also, it helps with our structure material. So our components don't have to be tested and qualified for, say, 40 years or 6 years lifetime. It's only in 4 to 8 years. It will reduce the manufacturing cost, it will reduce the maintenance cost. So that's why we're gonna replace them. So instead of having to demonstrate the core can last for 60, 80 years, we say we only demonstrate for 4 or 8 years. So that's much reasonable, and the cost will be much lower. Now, you're concerned about the spent fuel. Actually, the fuel will not be, the volume of the spent fuel will not be increased, because the fuel will reach its design burnup and will be drained out from the core, which is very similar to what happened to the LWR. The LWR fuel, even though the reactor will last say 6 years, but the fuel will not last that long. The fuel has to be replaced every a year and a half or 2 years, something like that. So our volume of the spent fuel will be similar to other nuclear power plants. What's extra is the cans and the components themselves, but the volume of those are still very, very small. If you really think about the power the plant will generate each year. So that's for the third question. The fourth question, is the fuel drink tank also replaced as the can replaced? Yes, it's connected to the can. It will be replaced with the can. Okay, so
Okay.
I hope I answered those 4 questions.
Yes.
Should we go to the next one?
Yeah, we go to the next one.
Yeah, the next question, so there's 3 questions there. The first one is, the first one is, what will be happen if only one steam generator works, the other steam generator stops? So if that happens, we only have half of the power. That's what happens. And then 2, how much power needs to start up? The power plants will be started up by the century turbine, and the century turbine will be powered up by the auxiliary boiler. So the central turbine has the maximum output power of 15 megawatt electric. So that is the maximum power needed to start up, but the real power needed will be much smaller than that. The third question, how much the capacity of used fuel storage tanks, and for how long used fuel will keep in storage tanks? Well, the capacity of the used fuel storage will be adequate to store the used fuel for the operation of 80 years. So that's the design lifetime of the power plant. And how long a used fuel will keep in storage tanks? So again, the time will be 80 years or more. So once the power plant reached its design lifetime, the used fuel will be transferred from the power plant to other places, which we haven't got a exact number of years, but definitely longer than 80 years.
Okay, so before we continue, Pak Tagor, could you share Kun's presentation to the WhatsApp group for people can get it? All right.
Done, Pak.
Oh, done. Okay, very good.
Yeah, done, Pak Bob.
All right, thank you. So the next one from Febri.
Yes, the next one is TMSR 500 designed by considering a black start? Yes, absolutely. The equipment such as the Century turbo generator is for that purpose. Yes. Okay, so next question.
Could you elaborate how we manage the black start? How do we manage the black start?
I think I can give you a more detailed explanation in week 4. In week 4, we're going to talk about the operation. So we can go through from the very beginning to everything that you want to know.
Okay, sabar ya Febri ya. We next week 4.
Okay, Pak.
Thank you. Now from Helen.
Okay, so the question was from the energy flow diagram stated that the pod will generate 1580 kilowatt electric. Is it the kilowatt electric or kilowatt thermal value? I think there might be a misunderstanding. The value that is shown, I believe, is the power of the pump that's required. Let me just go back to that one, sharing screen. So if we go to here, I think what Helen meant is this value. Oh, sorry, I didn't have the pointer. Yeah, it's this value. It's the power required by the primary loop pump.
Okay.
Okay.
We are clear on that.
Yeah. All right. Let's go to the next
Ferry,
one.
Ferry Wibisono.
Yes. So what is the main reason SOCON decided to have two intermediate loops between primary loop and steam cycle? Okay. Tritium is one of the reasons. And the other reason, again, is to separate the steam cycle further away from the fuel source to give it extra barrier to control if there's some leak in the loops. So those are basically for safety considerations. And the second question, is it only for double protection to avoid any change of radioactive solid leak into water? Yes, absolutely. That's one of the main reasons. Do you think one intermediate loop is not enough? What about the heat loss between each cycles? We have done analysis on this. So one intermediate loop may be enough, because if you think about this, the first loop is fuel salt with highly radioactive. Second loop, even though it started with non-radioactive, but it will be activated. And then if you connect to the second loop to the steam cycle, it will not activate the steam cycle. But if you have a leak from the secondary loop to the steam cycle, you will have a radioactive materials getting the steam cycle. So for safety reasons, we add a extra tertiary loop. So you have absolutely no chance to leak. So we will lose some heat, but the starting temperature is very high, 700. So even with that heat loss taken into consideration, we still have very good thermal efficiency. We have a 60 something, much higher than the LWRs. Okay, so in case the cooling for freeze plug fails during the reactor operation, causing the reactor to be shut down incidentally and fuel source is drained, how much time roughly needed by the reactor to go back online? Okay, we developed a procedure to recover from that. I haven't got the exact time that required to restore the power back. Hopefully by week 4, when we start the operation, we will be able to supply some numbers. I hope that can satisfy you at this point.
Yeah, hopefully. Okay, so we don't have any other question. It's 9:15 now. I think we got another 10 minutes. To 10 o'clock. So anybody still have questions? Just please raise your hands or just speak to the microphone. No? Oh yeah, Pak Aziz. We have Pak Aziz, Dr. Aziz here from Bapeten. Please, Pak Aziz.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Kun. Okay, my question is dealing with flash valve again. There is a lot of discussion on the flash valve. As far as I remember from your explanation that you have higher temperature from the fuel and you provide cold fluid to keep the valve freeze and close. It means that you have high temperature from the fuel and low temperature from the cold fluid. So I imagine that there could be interface in between high temperature and low temperature, a high temperature gradient in the material. So this thermal this thermal stratification will last for at least for 4 years, because it will operate for 4 years. How do you maintain this? How do you maintain the integrity of the material when you have a high temperature gradient or high thermal stratification in the fridge valve? And that's my first question. My second question is, I'm referring to your previous core design that based on my rough calculation that you have very small shutdown margin of the control rod. It means that when you fail the freeze valve to drain the fluid, the fuel to the drain tank, so you will keep the fuel on the can, and slowly the fuel will get down, the temperature will get down, and you will have a higher reactivity. So the control rod will not be able to maintain the subcritical conditions if all of the freeze valve fail to drain the fuel. So what I observe is that you can shut down the reactor when the fuel is in hot temperature, but when the fuel decreases the temperature, for instance, 300 degree C, you will have supercritical condition in the core. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much for the question. Let me try to answer the first question about the freeze valve. Yes, the centerpiece of the freeze valve is the material and the geometry of the freeze valve. The constant thermal cycle, temperature highs and down, will degrade the material. Hopefully, I mean, fortunately, we're during the majority time of the operation, the freeze valve will be kept at low temperature by the external air cooling. So what happens is the temperature of the freeze valve will keep at a relatively constant temperature for a very, very long time. And that's good for the lifetime of the freeze valve. What's really challenging here is if you have to constantly heat it up and freeze it up. So that thermal cycle will cause thermal stress, and eventually the material may fail. So what we want to do, first of all, is to do extensive tests to find out how many thermal cycle this freeze valve can go through, and how long it can last. And it must be done extensively. Potentially the experiments or the test has to be monitored or supervised by the regulator. And that's a very important test. And during the operation, we have to limit the freeze valve to the cycles that it is allowed, to the temperature that is allowed. So there will be a thermocouple and other means of a temperature monitoring device that attached to the freeze valve to make sure it operates in the designed condition. So a combination of extensive equipment testing and the control of operational condition will ensure the freeze valve function as it designed. If we identified some freeze valve that malfunction, we have the option to replace it. Of course, we have to replace the can and the that from happening for economic reasons, but we do have that ultimate solution if we have to do that. So the second question is about the control rod. So I can't really comment on the old design because we know we have the design has revolved since, and I'm trying to get as much as information about the new design to you next week. I still don't know how much I can get because of the U.S. export control. But what I heard is the design has been improved. The control rod will have a much larger worth, so it will be able to shed the chain reaction. And what's important here is the temperature coefficient reactivity. Now, a lot of designers strive to get a very large negative value. I mean, large means deep negative. So very negative reactivity coefficient. And they say, okay, when temperature goes higher, you have a much better chance to shut it down. But curse, the other side of the story is when the temperature goes down, you have extra reactivity you have to handle with. So the reactivity coefficient cannot be too negative because of this phenomenon. So it has to be negative, but it has to be within a reasonable value, so you can safely shut the reactor down when the temperature goes lower. So in the new design, my understanding is that the reactivity coefficient has been adjusted to a proper value that will allows you both to shut the reactor down at high temperature and also maintain sub-criticality with the shutdown rods at a lower temperature. So I expect to give you more numbers in next week's training. So hopefully with these answers, they can satisfy you at this moment.
Gimana Pak Aziz? Any follow-up or are you satisfied with the answer?
Yeah, thank you anyway, but I'm looking forward for the new design, and also because another issue about the void reactivity is a positive and high positive for referring to the old design. Hopefully for the updated design, even the void reactivity could be a negative, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so it is now 10 o'clock. Maybe one last questions. One last quick questions now. Anybody? Okay. No last questions. Nothing. Okay, so if we don't have any last question, maybe last word from you, Kun, before we close. Last statement from you.
I just want to thank you everybody for staying that late to be in the workshop, and the question were excellent. I'm very much looking forward to hear more of the questions. I'll try my best to answer your question. And again, I mean, with all this participation, I'm very excited about the workshop in the coming weeks. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Kun. So so next week we have a guest speaker, right? We have a guest speaker.
Yes. So next week, my colleague Manu from Milano, Italy, will be joining us to introduce the neutronics and neutronic thermal hydrous coupling in the core. So
could you tell us who is this Manu guy? What does he do?
Yeah, so Manu has got a PhD from the Polytechnic in Milano, and he also studied in University of California, Berkeley. So he's the expert in neutronics. He has been supporting SOCON for neutronics and core thermal hydraulic neutronic coupling for many years. So his talk will be, I think I'm very excited to hear what he's going to talk about the new core. So hopefully, but the only uncertainty is the U.S. export control. So Lars and others from ThorCon US, they're working very hard to get approval from the U.S. government to release certain information. But I'm remaining hopeful. So we will know better when next time when we have the workshop.
So okay, so thank you very much everybody. So we'll see you next week. So terima kasih semuanya. Kita mau foto saat terakhir ya. Oke, mungkin kita foto juga deh. So we take picture, Kun, everybody, you know, show your faces. AJF, Aknafan, you there?
Ya, Bapak.
Okay. Yeah, make the counting.
Okay. One, two, three.
Okay.
Last one. One, two, three.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. See you. Thank you very much, Kun. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.